Hey readers, welcome back to the library. I apologize for being late, but it is finally time to wrap up my reading year of 2022. 2023 is already off to a good start with reading Jon Fosse and McCarthy. And I feel like I have a lot of interesting and fun stuff planned out. I might just tackle The Wake this year. But let's dive into it. Let's see what my top 5 reads were of 2022. First out, at the number 5 spot, is her name. She had reddish hair and her name is Sabina by Julieta Campos. Julieta returns for a second year in a row. Last year, The Fear of Losing Eurydice was in my top 10, and I think that is a better book. I think this one is a bit harder to recommend unless you're really into the structural playfulness and very postmodernist and sort of artificial layer to the writing. Memory is central, but there's also commentary by the narrator and the protagonists of the story on the act of writing. A lot of Campos's ideas on literary theory bleed into this work. She's quoted as saying, "My reflexive and critical discourse and my fiction slide so imperceptibly by each other that it's difficult to separate or distinguish. Each time my criticism is less isolated from narrative forms in a kind of symbiosis between criticism and fiction." And I really enjoy what Julieta Campos does in this sort of self-reflexive, intelligent, smart work. The idea of plot and how it's sort of, I feel like the structure kind of comes in like waves. And the book also starts with the protagonist saying that I am not here. I am on another shore 22 years ago. There's a long pier, and at this hour the waves are already gray, the color of melted lead. They're getting choppy because night is coming on. If this were the beginning of a novel, it should have begun this way. For a long time I used to go to bed early, sometimes when I had put out my candle. But I do not know how it would have ended, because the narrator would have been someone else, and it would have been water lilies on belfries or beaches in Normandy, or, above all, that inconceivable confidence in the power of the word. This is my novel, it must be. And Proust's sentence would have been no help after all. The truth is, I have never known where to start. There are so many words and so little to say. And this sort of meta commentary on narration and how to possibly write the novel you're reading kind of ebbs in and out of focus, and the result is an intellectually stimulating and fun read. But I do realize that it's not for everyone. But I really love Campos, and sadly there's only one more translated book of hers to read. At number 4, it's a favorite of last year. It's Ricardo Piglia's The Absent City. I believe my first encounter with Piglia was the Feeling Bookish podcast, that their episode 37 they did on the Diaries of Emilio Renzi. And I started reading that, and I was so captivated that I decided that Piglia was going to be more important in my life, and I paused the reading of the Diaries and picked a random book to read, and I picked The Absent City, and it absolutely blew me away. It's a fantastic book. It's very short. It's only like 160 pages long, and it starts kind of conventionally with being like a futuristic detective novel. But as it goes on, the narrative fractures, and we get parallel stories that become a lot stranger. One of the storylines follows a machine that's based on the mind and the memory of a woman named Elena. And this machine produces facts about the world around her, and the police wants to destroy this machine. So there's all these different genres in these little stories that keep interrupting each other and intertwining, and it's this detective story. There's cyberpunk. There is more romantic figures, and there is a huge love letter to James Joyce in the second half, and it was just magical. I don't want to spoil too much. I would just say read The Absent City. Even if the first 60 pages don't grab you, then just keep reading. This was also the book where I first learned of Macedonio Fernandez. I should really do a full video on Piglia, because he's really become one of my favorites. Number 3 should come as no surprise to people who I chat with on Discord or who watch my channel regularly. Paperbird already guessed it in the comments. It's A Fish and Game and Butterflies by Pierre Begonio. I'm not going to say too much about this as I've made a full video on it, but it's very nice that people are starting to get back to me now, and they have read it and agree that this is fantastic. I talked to a friend earlier today, and I was just saying that in Bergonio I have found stylistically my ideal, I think. The voice, the imagery, just painterly, beautifully evocative prose, and also very philosophically keen, full of wisdom. This could be read as just for an education on writing, but the content is by no mean vapid either. So I hope you pick up A Fish and Game and Butterflies. At number 2, it's another Riccardo Piglia. It's the first volume of the Diaries of Emilio Renzi. Now, I do feel bad about having a repeat author here, but these works are so different that you can't really just bundle them together, I think. Piglia wrote these notebooks throughout his entire life. It was 327 notebooks in total, and he became fatally ill and would then have like an immense time pressure to try to take all these notebooks and extract and compile them into something that would be as important as he thought that it would be. The second volume of the Diaries begins with a sick Piglia who's transcribing and talking to a young woman who is helping him make sense of all these notebooks. And these are interesting. He has written these diaries under his alter ego, Emilio Renzi, which is a character that shows up in most, if not all, of his works. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But he showed up in everything I've read. And it's clear that this is some sort of autofiction. There's a lot of Piglia in this. I mean, he writes about his time in school and in university. He talks about the books he reads, the lessons he learns, how he parses and understands certain philosophers, tells stories about his family, about his difficult relationship with his father, and particularly all of this talk about how essential reading is for his life is just fantastic. It's like I have a friend in this book, and at any point of feeling lonely, I can just open up this and have a conversation with a friend. It's truly a thing of beauty. More about this entire series in a later video. Before we get to the number one, here is a book that would have been number one if it hadn't been a reread from a previous year. It's James Joyce's Ulysses. And what a book this is. I'm not going to try to say anything new about it, but I feel like this works on so many levels. It's an interesting read. It's an interesting puzzle. It is a tour de force of just literary style. And it is really a book that gives and keeps on giving. You can read this your entire life, and I hope to read this book many more times. This year was, of course, extra special since I reread this book, and then I flew to Dublin and met up with some of my best friends from the United States, and we explored Dublin and enjoyed Bloomsday together. We, walked the streets, saw the landmarks from the novel. We met people from around the world with different levels of interest and enthusiasm about Joyce, and it was truly special. You notice that as I get older, the community aspect of reading means more and more to me, and that's why I'm doing this on YouTube too, and thank all of you who comment and reach out. And finally, we get to the number one spot. It's no surprise. It's Solenoid by Mircea Cartarescu. So what to say about this book that hasn't been said better by others before? Cartarescu is one of my favorites. I really love Blinding, and this was fantastic, but I don't know if I can say it was better than Blinding or not. I think certain parts I enjoyed better in Blinding. He explores some of the same tuberculosis preventatorium stories in both books, and I think that it's more, pleasant is a strange word, but I enjoyed more in Blinding. He paints these books with very different palettes. I feel like there's more bright purples and golds in Blinding, where this is kind of like its cover. It's more gray, abject poverty, filth, and there's lots of beautiful imagery in Solenoid as well, don't get me wrong, but it does read differently. I think it's interesting that Romanian authors that I've read have some similarities in the sort of rich phantasmagorical imagery. Max Blecher and Christina Tudor-Sideri also have very vivid and rich imagery in a way that there's not too many others I will compare it to. Maybe Bruno Schultz has something similar going. But Solenoid is, I suppose, the story of Mircea's double. We have described a very similar person to Mircea Cărtărescu, except he never had the success as a writer that the real Mircea had. Get described a mostly unremarkable life, but with a remarkable inner life. We hear stories about his childhood and his growing up, and books is the one constant. He reads so much, and that also ties in with plot developments later on. There are stories about children in sanatoriums. There are cults of dreamers and an actual transfer into the body of a mite. And it's all interesting. It's a captivating and quick read despite having so many pages. The writing is fantastic. That he keeps this quality of imagery going for so long is very impressive. And you sort of weave in between different episodes. I'm not quite sure how it will end up on my list long term. I need to think more about this book, and I think that it needs time to coalesce in my mind. But it was 100% the best read of a new work of fiction I read in 2022. And that's it for this year. I'm sorry that I was so late with this, but I read some fantastic books, and I've seen on booktube and Instagram and Twitter that a lot of people had fantastic reading years last year, and if you made it through, then thank you, and I would very much appreciate you sharing some of your good reads from 2022, and maybe even more excitingly, what have you planned for this year? Thank you so much for watching.